the presentation to be informative and helpful. You're probably starting to see more and more discussions and or articles and topics regarding hardware as a service. And in this day and age, with hardware becoming more and more difficult to get with our supply chain issues and things of that nature, and with requirements always chasing you of needing upgrades, it almost becomes a question of there's got to be a better way, So I think this option certainly for a lot of people, you find it just probably makes more sense than chasing the upgrades of new hardware all the time. And as I will say a lot of times to clients that I call on, don't you just want to get out of the hardware business? And this option here certainly gives you that kind of a perspective and an option. But it's called hardware as a service, or you might hear referred to as HaaS, HaaS. And with this presentation today, we're going to go over the introduction to hardware as a service model, the pros and cons of the as a service model, as well as the service offerings. It's going to be a general discussion. This isn't necessarily about Dynamic Quest and what we do. This is about the industry and how hardware as a service functions as a general solution to whatever MSP you may work with. Certainly we're open to answering questions you may have at the end about how it may work specifically, and what are the pros and cons about certain aspects of it. We welcome that. That's what we're here for. This is what the presentation is here today for. Shouldn't take a tremendous amount of time, but hopefully we'll cover the important aspects of what you expect to know. So the introduction. So what is hardware as a service? Hardware as a service, it includes a wide variety of products and technologies that you can take advantage of through a subscription model versus owning it. That's really at its core what HaaS is. Subscribing to having hardware provided to you versus owning it has some unique advantages that we're going to discuss here in a moment. And it is like leasing, in which the hardware belongs to the Dynamic Quest or the MSP that you're working with, and it's placed in your at your site itself. This is probably the most important slide that we're going to cover today, and that's what is the hardware as a service model specifically. And this is where it adds value compared to maybe traditional leasing. The MSP that you work with is going to help you appropriate, design, configure, and procure the hardware that you need, what fits best for your model. And that's really a unique advantage because leasing companies don't do that. Perhaps where you purchase it or how you're procuring that hardware today, you may or may not be working closely with your MSP to determine what's required or what's the best fit. You also may not look long-term with it. You may look to try to get the least expensive solution that you can purchase because you're very concerned with capital expenditure. You don't have $1,800 per device for a workstation, or maybe you don't want to have the money to go out and invest in an expensive server that's going to cost you $10,000 for the server and $10,000 to install it. So those components can certainly be difficult to understand what's the best for your business. So hardware as a service will typically include the procurement and help you design what the best solution is for your requirements, not only now, but 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now, depending on the device. It also typically will include configuration, custom imaging, managing, implementing, and potentially even encrypting those devices as part of that model. So that's a huge benefit. Certainly, being able to get that device set up properly on your network is a huge component of hardware as a service. So not only are you getting the procurement side, getting it configured properly, you're getting it imaged properly and implemented, as well as installed and the data migrated. That's a typical installation model for hardware as a service. So it is a full, complete option. Now, this certainly applies to workstations, servers, network attached storage, storage array networks. So it certainly is a major benefit when you are looking to upgrade and keep your network upgraded. It also allows you flexibility. So if you need to upgrade a piece of hardware, if you need a new, maybe perhaps the workstations you have don't meet the requirements of your business. Since it's a service, you can implement a new contract and procure the new hardware that you need that meets the requirements of that ERP solution. Or perhaps you're implementing another new software application that requires certain requirements, and you need specific users to have specific capabilities. Suppose there's a new operating system being released and your OS and your hardware doesn't meet those requirements, and you need to be able to have the flexibility to upgrade to those for better performance. This is where hardware as a service can be a major benefit to you. The caveats with hardware as a service is it does typically require some type of a managed IT support model included. So if you're a client that perhaps is on an hourly agreement with your MSP, or you're doing an engagement that doesn't require full management or doesn't do full management of your entire network, this particular model would look probably different. Some of the components of the items I just mentioned regarding configuration, custom imaging, migration of data, those things, unless you're on a fully managed IT support model, may incur additional hourly fees and things of that nature. So when hardware as a service is typically implemented, it is usually in a model where it's a fully managed IT support solution by your MSP, almost always, because the two go hand in hand. You're buying the hardware as a service, but it has to be coupled with the support model that the MSP is providing. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, we'll certainly can come back to that. You can ask additional questions to make sure you got a good understanding of that. For most MSPs, the idea and the concept is you want to promote stability and reliability within your client's network. To do that, you have to have hardware that supports that model. Every day we'll take over environments from clients where they're utilizing, in most cases, some very old hardware. And it can be very difficult to give you the stability and the reliability that you need, regardless of the tools that are installed, unless you have the hardware to support that model. If you've got a 7-year-old workstation or a 12-year-old switch or a firewall that's no longer supported, those items can be very difficult to support as an MSP, and it could create some severe productivity issues for you and your users. And forget about the security implications. So hardware as a service, certainly, just besides the stability and reliability, it's a very, very much coupled with the security of your network. So you've got to make sure that you're staying up to date with your hardware to ensure that the security of your network is in place. So what hardware is included? Workstations, laptops, firewalls, servers, network devices such as switches, Wi-Fi access points, a SAN for central storage, and NAS for network attached storage. So it really, those are the primary options that you'd probably run into, but hardware as a service can encompass from the core of your network to the edge. And again, the concept is clear. to keep you up to date, keep you running an optimal performance, and in the best secure method that you could be. So the pros and cons. So pros and cons, unlike hardware leasing, POS paired with managed IT service provides additional tech support that promotes reliability and stability. So that's a major pro. It works with your managed service provider, ensures your tech stack is being properly monitored, that you can scale with your hardware over time. It is a major pro, no question about it. Much different than leasing in that regard because it is paired with managed services. The concept is not only do you want to sell the hardware, but we also want to make sure you're getting the best support attached to that, which would mean patch management, monitoring. It would be ensuring that that you're fully covered with a warranty on that hardware, that you've got all the appropriate subscriptions and support. So that is something that is very key. It's all coupled with this. It's one contract. You don't have us or your MSP with a leasing company. You have one vendor that's going to provide all services, the support of the devices and the hardware, as well as the provisioning and the setup, the installation. So it really does put you in the catbird seat in regards to not having a lot of the headaches that you deal with today. I can't tell you how many clients I'll walk into and I'll see old PCs laying around. They're in server rooms, they're in offices, they're under desks. It's just because things will go out of service, they'll go out of support, and they think, well, maybe we'll need that. And then 4 years later, there it sits. So it just doesn't make sense. I think in most cases for clients to be in that hardware business and get stuck with gear that goes out of date, out of support. It's no longer being utilized, sitting around and making your office a mess and not knowing what's current, what's not current, what could be reused, what can't be reused. Key component, lower capital expenditure. So without question, not having to come up with all of that cost up front to replace, when you talk about some of these devices, I mean, the average workstation could run anywhere from $800 to $1,200 or more, depending on how it has to be configured. The average laptop will probably run you $1,000 or more. When you start getting, you do any amount of refresh and you've got a decent sized office, it's easy to get into some big money when you start talking about having to refresh a number of workstations. Talking about your core network, when you're talking about servers, sometimes it's not just the hardware, it's the licensing that goes on those servers that can add up into the thousands. So it gets very expensive very quickly, as you well know, when you're provisioning any amount of hardware. And by doing it with hardware as a service, you don't have to come up with that big upfront cost. There's not a big upfront cost for installation and configuration. You may have some costs when you're talking about a server and its migration of data. There may be some other soft costs out there related to a project that are not included with a HOS model, and that will vary depending on who you're working with. But typically, most of the time, it's talking about imaging. It's related to setup and configuration, but there may be some other soft costs depending on what you're upgrading and what you need to do and how it needs to be configured. There may be some other costs, but in general, most of the cost is going to be sucked up under the HOS model and will save you a whole bunch of money up front. Again, one of the other pros is it's going to give you the latest technology. You're going to be able to access the latest that's out there if you keep it refreshed. Some people are doing that already. Some people are refreshing workstations and laptops every quarter or every year, where they're buying a certain number, and that works out great. And you keep up to date. You know how many you're going to buy. You know how many you overall you have. But in general, a lot of clients don't do that. A lot of people don't do that, and they don't have that in the budget. So they end up purchasing them as they need them. As they fail or as new people come in, they're hired, which is fine. But this model really keeps you on a cycle, because you're not going to keep them any longer than, usually for us on a workstation, it's 4 years. For a firewall, it might be 3 to 4 years. For a server, usually it's 5 years. Switches, 5 years. So it depends on the type of device. We might say the term is going to be of that Haas agreement is going to vary based on the requirements. But that's usually rule of thumb. Those are some of the terms that we usually see for those types of devices, is anywhere from 4 to 5 years, depending on the device itself. So what are some of the cons? Certainly, you're going to be committed to financing terms. Once they're in place, you really can't. There's no advantage to an early termination, because you have to buy out the term of the contract. So it is a service. So if you sign for 48 months, and say at 24 months, typically you say, hey, I came into some money. There's some money that the company wasn't expected. We're just going to go ahead and buy out the remaining term. You can do that, but there's really no benefit, because it's just the same amount that it's going to be. And depending on the client or the MSP that you're working with, the hardware as a service, you may or may not have an option to buy the hardware. Some do, some don't, depending on the hardware. So it really is a service. It's not like a traditional lease where it's fair market value buyout at the end of the term or dollar buyout. It's going to vary. Some clients will let you buy it. Some MSPs will let you buy it. Some won't. And typically the agreements are long term. If you're signing on for a server, it's usually a 5-year term. If it's for workstations, it's a 4-year term. So the term agreements are typically a little bit longer, and they really need to be, because number one, you're not going to necessarily need to refresh them as quick, but at the same time, it makes it more worthwhile, because it keeps your payments in line, so you don't have a very super high monthly payment to pay back that hardware. So how do you take advantage of Haas? If you're a Dynamic Quest client, you can certainly reach out to your account manager or to your account executive. If you're someone that's not one of our clients and you want to evaluate that, certainly there are MSPs besides ourselves that offer this as a service. And of course, we'll build out a customized model based on your situation. And anyone will do that and try to provide you what we believe to be the best solution for your situation. But folks, I know that was pretty quick, but that's hardware as a service in a nutshell. Love to open it up for questions and answers. If anybody has anything they'd like to ask about what we just talked about, I am more than happy to answer those. Hello?
Everyone should be able to use their mic. So if you do have a question, feel free to unmute. If not, we'll leave it to Darren.
Hey, Darren, this is Mark. I think you mentioned this, but switches fall in that line as well, right, for hardware as a service?
They do. So switches certainly for any networking needs. That also extends to wireless access points and firewalls, of course. So your whole networked environment, and that again can be expensive, and that's a lot of times that's one of the neglected areas we typically see. Switches don't need to be replaced often as workstations and servers and things of that nature, or as workstations, but about the same time as servers. 5 years is usually our recommendation on switches. But it is one of those things that people will run them until ports start failing, and they say, wow, I just upgraded my bandwidth, and I'll be darned, I'm not getting very good through," and it turns out that the switches just can't accommodate, or They have a throttle point with their firewall. Their firewall can't accommodate that. So certainly something. There's a lot of validity in making sure that you look at the edge of your network, such as your switches and your firewalls, to ensure it's keeping up with your needs.
One more thing, can you go into a little bit more detail on what happens at the end of the term?
Well, it depends on the MSP that you're working with. At the end of the term, you can either with, say, someone like Dynamic Quest, you can go month to month and run it that way until, or they'll be approached most likely by us to talk about renewing and refreshing. But at the end of that term, you can either go month to month in most cases, or you'll renew it and you'll get a whole new stack of hardware. Any other questions, folks? Great questions, Mark. Thanks for asking that. I think that was great.
Thanks for the info.
Yep. Well, if that's all we have, we'll go ahead and end the call. We will be sending out this webinar after the call to the people who attended and the people who weren't able to attend for one reason or another. But we appreciate everybody's attendance. Again, feel free to reach out to us if you'd like additional information about how we may assist with this service or solution. Glad to answer any questions that you have. Have a great afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry, yeah.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, folks. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.